Is Elijah here?
So he's on about to respond now. He's going to make some of us on co-host now.
Okay.
Elijah, I never make us co-host though. Now only you be the host. Enjoy Jibure.
Shongbowo no hosting.
Elijah is making us co-host now. Starboy join
Okay.
and shaking in now.
Human activities, from pollution to overpopulation, are driving up the Earth's temperature and fundamentally changing the world around us. The main cause is a phenomenon known as the greenhouse effect. Gases in the atmosphere, such as water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons, let the sun's light in, but keep some of the heat from escaping, like the glass walls of a greenhouse. The more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the more heat gets trapped, strengthening the greenhouse effect and increasing the Earth's temperature. Human activities, like the burning of fossil fuels, have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by more than 1/3 since the Industrial Revolution. The rapid increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has warmed the planet at an alarming rate. While Earth's climate has fluctuated in the past, atmospheric carbon dioxide hasn't reached today's levels in hundreds of thousands of years. Climate change has consequences for our oceans, our weather, our food sources, and our health. Ice sheets, such as Greenland and Antarctica, are melting. The extra water that was once held in glaciers causes sea levels to rise and spills out of the oceans, flooding coastal regions. Warmer temperatures also make weather more extreme. This means not only more intense major storms, floods, and heavy snowfall, but also longer and more frequent droughts. These changes in weather pose challenges. Growing crops becomes more difficult. The areas where plants and animals can live shift, and water supplies are diminished. In addition to creating new agricultural challenges, climate change can directly affect people's physical health. In urban areas, the warmer atmosphere creates an environment that traps and increases the amount of smog. This is because smog contains ozone particles. Exposure to higher levels of smog can cause health problems such as asthma, heart disease, and lung cancer. Humans are also the ones who can combat it. If we work to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources like solar and wind, which don't produce greenhouse gas emissions of climate change.
Agun. Are you using two devices?
Human activity.
Are you using two devices?
Oh, yes, ma'am. My system and the laptop, ma'am. I mean, system and the
From
phone.
pollution
But it will
to
not echo.
overpopulation are driving up
No,
around
will
us.
affect, ma'am. The system and it's not affect, ma'am.
The main cause is the
Like Elijah's network is bad.
gases in the atmosphere
Okay. Because we
such as water
yes.
vapor, carbon
Do you need the access to be able to
dioxide,
share?
methane, nitrous
Okay.
oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons let the
Elijah,
sunlight in.
Elijah, Elijah. Is Elijah here? Shagun,
He's trying to locate his phone, man. Maybe I'll get your phone and
his phone. Now, because the guest speaker is asking if he can share, but he wants to join now. So maybe when he joins, he will try to see if he can share his slides.
would make him the on course, man, so he'll be able to share his slides, man. And share his screen.
Okay, but you can only do that when he joins now.
Yes, man, he joins, man.
Okay.
Activities like the burning of fossil fuels have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by more than a third since the Industrial Revolution. The rapid increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has warmed the planet at an alarming rate.
Droughts, floods, and extreme heat have hit Africa hard over the years. Deadly forests and vegetation are shrinking at an alarming rate. Wetlands are drying up. Cultural productivity is also falling as the
Africa, like many regions in the world, is warming faster. To give a number, so the actual rate of warming over the last decade before. And to give you another number is 0.37, was the fifth warmest year, 1.50.
1.5 degrees is sort of getting to the level where the become even more catastrophic if we let the global 5 degrees and approaches 2 degrees centigrade higher than, because we are not tackling the issue with the at the scale and as fast as we are supposed to be.
Experts warn that greenhouse gases from human activities such as burning fossil fuels are contributing significantly to these hazards.
This long-term warming trend, it's driven by continued increases in concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the three main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, they all reached record observed highs.
Africa is responsible for less than 4% of the world's carbon emissions, according to the United Nations. However, it has been by far the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change.
And it's time to break our addiction to fossil fuels and invest in a just and equitable transition. We need to see credible plans to exit coal by 2030 for OECD countries and by 2040 for the rest of the world.
What do ordinary people make of the climate change conversation and action?
The one influencing a lot of decisions during these talks, Africans are not discussing actually the real.
We want renewable energy now. We want sustainable energy in Africa now. Africa is capable of clean energy and driving sustainable change towards a better future.
When I think about climate change, I think about human rights. You can't talk about climate change without having a human rights lens. Me, I believe the whole climate conversation should be inclusive of intersectionality. Feminists are women, are the ones who produce food for us to eat.
In 2022, more than 110 million people in Africa were directly affected by climate-related hazards. Countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia in the Horn of Africa faced their worst drought in 40 years. The drought displaced more than 500,000 people in Ethiopia and nearly 1.2 million in Somalia. There were about 5,000 fatalities, of which 48% were associated with drought and 43% with flooding, according to the Emergency Event Database.
By last year, the Horn of Africa was really embroiled in a very, very severe drought, which where the rainfalls have failed for 4 consecutive seasons. And that has led to severe failure of farming in the region, with hunger, starvation, death of livestock. Another one is flooding. There have been devastating floods in West Africa, say in Nigeria. Again, last year, there the worst flooding to the death, loss of lives and property.
One of the worst floods in decades in Africa occurred in the Libyan city of Derna recently, following a massive storm. Thousands of people died. So far, 2023 is said to be the second hottest year on record in the world, marginally behind 2016.
There are several reports showing that things are getting worse because we are not tackling the problem at its roots, and we are not tackling it with the adequate tools that we have, and at the scale that we need to tackle it more. In some places, you are getting the second hottest year ever on record, but in other places, you are getting the hottest.
Many African countries are now shifting towards clean energy with low carbon technologies and tax systems, including resilient infrastructure. Morocco, for instance, has built the world's largest concentrated solar facility, Noor, to help achieve the country's goal of 52% renewable energy mix by 2030. The advanced 6,000-acre solar complex serves as a clean energy source for over 1 million Moroccans. And in June 2019, South Africa introduced a Carbon Tax Act, which places specific levies on greenhouse gases from fuel
Nigeria, we hail thee, our own dear native land. Though tribe and tongue may differ, in brotherhood we stand. Nigerians justice reign, in peace or battle honored, and this we count as gain. To hang unto our children a banner without stain. Oh God.
Mr. Bola.
It's like Agbola is off.
Good afternoon, everyone.
He's
And
here.
to those on the other side of the time zone, good morning or good evening. I guess my evening. So my name is Shegan Deli. I'm a volunteer with Phenomenal Strides Foundation, an NGO dedicated towards advancing the cause of community development and youth empowerment in Nigeria. And as part of our programs, we organize capacity building programs for different categories of individuals and stakeholders. And previously we had on capacity building for youths, but today we'll be having one that has to do with two issues: drug abuse and climate changes. But before we proceed, I'd like to roll out some ground rules for this program. Please ensure that you are muted when you're not talking. And if you want to raise any points, you could just notify by a raise of hand. And also it is pertinent for us to get to know on one another. And you can do this by typing our name and affiliated organization in the chat box. And I wish us all a fruitful capacity building program. Thank you very much once again. Oh, by the way, hello, am I still audible? So I'd like to bring on to this virtual podium on the CEO and the convener of today's program, on Biba Odili, for our opening remarks. Can you please unmute, please?
Thank you, Shegun, and to all our distinguished participants who are on this call. So good evening, distinguished participants. I am excited to welcome you all to this second capacity building program organized by the Phenomenal Strides Foundation under the theme, Integrating Climate Change Actions with Drug Demand Strategies. This event is in line with the focus of Phenomenal Strides Foundation in strengthening families and communities to foster community security, safety, and prosperity. Climate change and drug demand reduction actions are on the front burner of global and national conversations. They are not just rhetoric, but our current and living realities. The impact of climate change is increasingly affecting social, environmental, economic, and public health issues. Its effects on livelihoods, particularly in marginalized communities, is producing new vulnerabilities, which includes the risk of drug abuse. Extreme weather events driven by climate change are a major cause of displacement of families and communities worldwide, Nigeria not being an exception. Loss of income from failed crops and food insecurity can lead to increased psychosocial stressors, exacerbating mental health challenges, which may increase demand for drugs as coping mechanisms and also complicate treatment and treatment interventions and rehabilitation interventions. It is against this backdrop that Phenomenal Strides Foundation is hosting this virtual event, which is not only timely but pertinent to escalate discussions, provoke thoughts, and provide a platform to explore collaborative, community-driven solutions that will address both environmental and social vulnerabilities driven by climate change and drug abuse. As practitioners and stakeholders, we need to take proactive steps to stem the tide of new entrants finding their way into the web of drug abuse, those who are getting more dependent on drugs, and those whose complications are getting worse. As we provide interventions to address established triggers, it is crucial also that we recognize and equally tackle the new enablers, a space in which climate change is playing a critical role. By integrating climate change actions into drug demand strategies, practitioners will be providing multiple positive outcomes, including reduced demand for drugs, building resilient communities, addressing vulnerabilities among populations affected by both climate change and drug abuse. Overall, this integration will align policies and innovation synergies, enhance preparedness, reduce costs, and promote health equity by simultaneously addressing two critical community challenges affecting every aspect of development, progress, and sustainability. Once again, I welcome you all and urge us to sit back and attentively listen to Professor Ibrahim Wakawa, a seasoned global expert whom we are privileged to have as our erudite guest speaker, as he shares from his vast wealth of knowledge and multi-sectoral experiences on the topic of discourse. I implore us to be generous in sharing and learning with enthusiasm. I wish us all a rewarding experience. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Senami, can you go ahead with the guest speaker's profile, please?
Okay.
I implore us to be generous in sharing and learning.
Dr. Ibrahim Wakawa.
Thank you very much, Ma. Continue, Ansena, please.
Dr. Ibrahim Wakawa Abdul is a professor of general adult and consultation listening psychiatry with special interest in addiction psychiatry with the University of Maiduguri and chief consultant psychiatrist with the Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital, Maiduguri, Borno State. He is the immediate past medical director of the Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital, Maiduguri, Borno State, where he had shared and co-chaired several national programs. He led the implementation of the mental health and psychosocial thematic component of the health and nutrition emergency response in Borno State that was anchored by the Federal Ministry of Health in Borno State in the year 2016. He also led the federal government team that piloted the use of Mentadol for opioid substitution in Nigeria. He has at various times served as the chairman of the National Technical Working Group on Harm Reduction. He is an expert in mental health administration and has contributed to the development of several national mental health and substance use guidelines and standard operating procedures. As an academic, he had training both locally and internationally. He is widely traveled and has attended international conferences across all the continents of the globe. He has over 80 publications both within local and international journals. He is an internationally certified addiction practitioner and served as the immediate past vice president of the International Society for Substance Use Prevention and Treatment Professionals, Nigerian chapter, 2018 to 2025. He was a former chairman of the Nigerian Medical Association, Borno State chapter. He has served as principal investigator and co-investigator in several collaborative research. He loves reading and constructive networking. He's an external assessor to several universities within Nigeria and an examiner with the West African College of Physicians in the Faculty of Psychiatry. He belongs to several professional organizations. He is passionate about mental health research and advocacy, as well as advocacy for the rights of people with substance use disorder as a vulnerable group. He is currently serving as the head of the Mental Health and Behavioral Sciences Department of the University of Maiduguri and the lead consultant to the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, NDLA, for the development of the National Drug Control Master Plan, NDCMP 2026 to 2030. With a resounding virtual applaud, please make welcome Professor Wakanwa Abdu to the platform. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are.
Okay. So I'm the chairperson, chief executive of the Phenomenal Strides Foundation, and other distinguished members on this platform. Let me say a very good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever we are on the globe. I think I am humbled by the opportunity given to make a very important presentation this afternoon on a topic that is emerging. And I think it's very timely considering the global climate changes that we've been witnessing of recent. And of course, I am currently working with the University of Maiduguri, and I'm a consultant psychiatrist, like Apule said in my citation. I think I feel really humbled to be on this platform this afternoon. And the topic given to me was integrating climate change actions with drug demand reduction strategies. And of course, as a physician, I added a synergistic public health approach. I once again want to thank Madam Ibiba for giving me the opportunity. So I'm going to adapt this outline. Is my slide projected? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can see.
So I'm going to adopt this. Thank you. I'm going to adopt this outline in the presentation. I'm going to do an introduction. And of course, we're going to talk about the definition of terms. And we're going to look at historical perspective as to how climate change evolved and of how significant it is to the public health space. And we're going to look at climate change as a health emergency. And we're going to ask ourselves a very big question, that is the central question. What are the intersections between climate change and substance use disorder? And of course, what are drug demand reduction strategies? And what are the current drug demand reduction situation in Nigeria? And then we're going to look at the integrative strategies for drug demand reduction into climate change actions. And we're going to talk briefly about certain recommendations that I think will apply globally. So first of all, I think long before modern science, people noticed climate variability. For example, in the medieval period, there were warm periods, and they also discovered that there was shrinkage of the ice. And that affected settlements and affected virtually all agricultural practices in those times. This actually made early people, particularly people in the medieval period, to have a suspense. That is the climate really changing? If not, what is responsible for the shrinkage of the glaciers? And what is responsible for the increase in the warmth at that period? So that prompted early scientific investigations. And the first person that did a groundbreaking work on that area was John Baptiste Fourier. He did that work in 1824, and he described it as a greenhouse effect. By the greenhouse effect, he meant by human activities were generating certain gases that he referred to as greenhouse gases that are actually melting the glaciers and are actually contributing to the increase in the global warmth or global temperature at that time. Since the work of John Baptiste Fourier in 1824, there has been a lull in investigation in that area until John Tyndall in 1859 now proved and showed that gases can trap heat. And those gases that can trap heat are referred to as the greenhouse gases. And then in 1896, Svante Arrhenius, a very phenomenal philosopher, then calculated that there were changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, which could alter climate. Of course, from basic biology, we all know that we inhale oxygen and we exhale carbon dioxide. But obviously, it was not just due to human population. If it were just due to human population, it would have been an arrested event because with control in populations in certain parts of the globe, we'll later come to see the effect of climate changes on different parts of the globe. Then there would have been differences in those areas that are relatively less populated. Then first clear observation signals emerged through instrumental temperature records, which began in the mid-1800s, and many glaciers worldwide began to retreat from about the mid-19th century onward. There were among the first widely documented physical effects. And subsequently, there were definitive continuous measurements. Charles Killings in the year 1958 measured the carbon dioxide concentration and constructed a curve from 1958 upward. And that curve kept showing that there was a steady rise in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. And that curve that showed a steady rise in the concentration of carbon dioxide is referred to as the Killings curve. So global temperature data sets and more comprehensive observations in the mid-1950s to 1970s revealed a warming trend that on an annual basis, there's an increase of about 0.1 degrees centigrade or less to some extent. And in some extent, about 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So satellite images began, and the satellite era now began to show attribution. And from about 1979 onward, satellite images measured shrinking Arctic sea ice, and that there was massive loss in the concentration of glaciers. The glaciers are like the ice bodies that you find on oceans, and precise sea levels also increased. Obviously, if you have a cup of water and there's an ice block and it melts, the water volume will increase. That's just what is happening on the global basis. So by the mid-1990s, the United Nations set up an intergovernmental protective climate change convention precisely in 1995, and scientists concluded that there's a discernible human influence which existed, and subsequent assessments strengthened the attribution to human greenhouse gas emissions. So what are the impact of this climate change on the global population? Now, the number one thing that was seen is that there was an increase in mortality from when there was observed that the climate change, that global temperatures and of course the water volume are increasing, that there was an increase in mortality and also deterioration in other health indices. And these were mainly attributable to heat extremes, floods, storms, and changes in infectious disease patterns, which increase deaths and ill health. And well-documented events have proven this assertion. In 2003, for example, the European heat wave and then the 2010 Russian heat wave caused many thousands of excess deaths. It was never recorded in the previously, and it was never recorded previously, and it was thought The increase in the global temperature was responsible for that. The WHO then estimated, and this is commonly cited in most studies, that climate change could cause roughly about 250,000 additional deaths per year between the year 2030 to year 2050. So we are just 5 years away from the year 2030. So it means that from the year 2030 to 2050 on annual basis, there will be about 250,000 deaths that are attributable to global climate change. And these deaths may be from malnutrition, be from malaria, because if there are differences, if there are increase in temperature and an increase in the water level, there are ecological changes that could promote the growth of the insect vectors that will actually carry these diseases. And there will be increase in the real diseases and heat waves all over. But estimates vary with different scenarios and the models of assumption. And just like it was said by the chief executive of Phenomenal Strides Foundation at the beginning, that most vulnerable groups will be affected. And of course, most of these vulnerable groups include people, older adults, includes women, includes children, and includes people with chronic diseases like HIV in this era, and people that belong to low economic communities, which are the most vulnerable. So the effect of climate changes, and particularly the public health effects, are likely to be felt amongst them. Then the second impact on climate change will affect the food and water security in the world, and as well as nutrition. Of course, higher temperatures which lead to changing rainfall pattern, and more extremes will reduce yields from some staples in many regions, and this will increase risks of flooding, food insecurity, and malnutrition for millions. Apart from that, there will be a changing pattern of cultivation, because people will now try to actually attempt cultivate food crops or staples that are drought resistant. For instance, a studies conducted in Afghanistan and part of Pakistan in the early 2000s indicated that the growth and cultivation of opium poppy, which is actually used for the production of narcotics, such as heroin and others, increased because the opium poppy plant is drought resistant and can withstand growth in an environment that is devoid of much rainfall. And of course, the global change will promote, or the climate change will promote the growth of such crops. So you see, if there's an increased production of the opium poppy, it means the global output of opium poppy will increase, and the production of heroin and other narcotics will also increase, and it will lead to increase in supply, and proportionately, you expect that there will be an increase in the number of users. And then droughts could also alter the hydrology, that is the water level, and of course will threaten fresh water availability for agriculture and for drinking for vulnerable populations. These are frank realities. If you are up north here, particularly in part of Borno, Yobe State, if you go to the northern part, extreme northern parts of the state, people are living in virtually an environment where you have rainy season for 2 months, and the whole entire 10 months they live in very harsh, dry conditions. And of course, satellite images have indicated that the volume of the Lake Chad, which subserved part of Niger Republic, Cameroon, and of course, most part of it in Nigeria, have shrunken to less than 1/10 the previous size if you compare to the year 1973. I have satellite images that I will have shown, but due to time constraints, I couldn't indicate, but I will upload them after the presentation. And then droughts now could lead to other problems. If there are droughts, definitely there will be migrations, and of course there will be displacements. And then climate hazards such as floods, rising sea levels, drought, extreme storms force people to move temporarily or permanently. So the World Bank's Groundswell report in 2018 estimated that up to about 43 million people will be displaced or will migrate internally by the year 2050 across sub-Saharan Africa due to the effect of climate change. And of course, some parts of Southeast Asia and Latin America under a high emissions gas scenario. And this is just a regional, not global estimate. So if this 150 million people will be displaced or migrate from their ancestral homes due to global change, global climate changes in just sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, you can guess what will happen if the whole global estimate is to be taken into consideration. And it has been estimated that low-lying islands, island states, and densely populated coastal deltas, of course, everybody that is around in Nigeria for the past 5 years knows what has been happening in the states of the Niger Delta, particularly within the months of August and September due to effects of flooding. And of course, in confluence states like Kogi in Nigeria, everybody knows what happens. And of course, in upland states, even as far as Adamawa and parts of Taraba on an annual basis, there are loss of food crops and of course, displacements of communities due to flooding. These are all due to the impact of global climate change. And of course, when there are displacements and of course migration, there are associated economic impacts. So crops are losses whenever there are such floods. There are damage to critical infrastructure. There's reduced labor and productivity, especially from heat. And of course, when there are damages to the environment and livelihoods, and of course, there's disruption of services, which can push people into poverty and reduce long-term development prospects. In Nigeria already, I think based on the recent report by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, it has been shown that over 70% of the population are living in multidimensional poverty. So if this condition continues, it's projected that the number will even be higher. And then climate impacts disproportionately hot, poorer communities and countries that have less capacity to adapt. So you hardly hear such climatic changes causing massive disruption in the most developed countries because they've already developed infrastructure in place that could adapt. If you've been to London and if you are to cross the Thames, you will see how the embankments across the whole city of London with the embankments well constructed, and you don't expect a flood. But if you come to Lokoja, where the River Niger confluences with the Benue, everybody knows on an annual basis what happens in those communities. So communities, particularly in the low and middle income countries of the world, are those that suffer the effects and consequences of the global climate change. And this ultimately changes the demography, and urbanization and inequality are promoted. Climate stress can accelerate urban migration. So of course, people living in the rural community that have lost their means of livelihood as a result of climate change will definitely migrate to urban areas to seek for better sources of livelihood. And this will change population distribution and strain the city infrastructural services. And this, in essence, will amplify pre-existing inequalities. Because if they come to the urban areas, they are likely to go to the Bronx or to the ghettos, where there are inequalities in terms of income, there are inequalities in terms of gender, there are already existing inequalities in terms of age, and of course, racial and ethnic differences. And this concentration risks more vulnerable groups. So this is a map of the world. If you see, the greener the place is, the more the better the climate adaptation, and the browner the place or the grayer it is, the more the impact of global changes. So you can see in Africa, if you look at Nigeria, there are, to some extent, most parts of Nigeria are to some extent ranging between yellow and green. But if you see areas concentrating around the Niger Delta and Lagos, you will see it's brown. It indicates that a lot of climate impacts are being felt there. But if you look at North America, look at from the Miami coast upward, you will see a densely brown area with some massive areas of gray, indicating that a lot of climate impact is being felt in those areas. And of course, this goes to buttress the earlier point we made that it's not just due to human concentration of human beings. If not, why should America, that is relatively sparsely populated compared to China, be browner than the other areas? So this indicates a lot of human activities, particularly that emits that generates carbon emission that is responsible for these global changes. And then the second map shows a change in global temperature for the past 50 years. And this is the effect of climate change on the global temperature from 1973 to, unfortunately, 1973 was my year of birth, to 2023. So you can see the temperature kept increasing from about -1 degree centigrade in 1973, and by now the temperature has increased by about 4 degrees centigrade over a 50-year period. So if we're going to make a projection that in 50 years now, and if it's going to be in arithmetic progression, there's an increase in the global temperature of about 4 degrees centigrade, what will the projection be in the next 50 years? So it's better imagined. So we can say maybe by 8 degrees centigrade, or by at most maybe 12 or 16 degrees centigrade. And if the global temperature is going to rise by that, it means there will be more dissolution of the glaciers and more volume of water will be emitted, and the risks of flooding will be higher. And of course, the global temperature will keep rising. That's the implication. And of course, societies that will be prone into desertification will increase, despite the government's effort in spending so many years in creating the Great Green Wall barriers, and that will be a wasteful venture. Now, this is another slide that shows the impact of climate change on global per capita income. So you can see, if we look at the other part, the browner it is, the more the impact, and the bluer it is, the less the impact. So you can see Africa has more impact, despite, if you refer to this previous slide, we generate less greenhouse gases. And of course, we bear the brunt at the end of the day. So it's really calls for global action. And that's why the United Nations, right from 1972, from their first observation, held so many climate change conferences and conventions. And the first one was held in 1972, and they did the UN Conference on Human Environment, and it was held in Stockholm. And this was one of the first major United Nations meeting to place environmental issues on the global agenda. After the 1972 meeting, the next most important meeting that was taken to actually look at the effect of climate change on the global scale was in 1998. And that led to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change by the United Nations Environmental Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, signaling formal ongoing international scientific attention. The most important one came in 1992 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was adopted in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And that was when it was acknowledged at the at the Earth Summit, and it was forcefully entered into in 1994. This is the UN treaty in which countries acknowledge that climate change is a serious global problem requiring corrective action. Unfortunately, United States of America up till now is, despite the fact that if you look at the previous map, that they were one of the greatest generators of the greenhouse gases, refused to be signatories to this global treaty. And then between 1997 to 2005, based on the 1992 observation, they developed the Kyoto Protocol. I think we've been hearing the Kyoto Protocol, which was negotiated under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, in 1997, and entered into force in 2005, the first binding emission reduction treaties for some countries. And then in 2007, the IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, brought their first assessment report, and that ended them winning a Nobel Prize together with Al Gore. Al Gore was the then outgoing US vice president, but he did a lot of advocacy and sensitization on the impact of global change, and in order to raise global awareness and UN focus on climate risks. So the IPCC were joint winners together with Al Gore when they submitted their report to the UN Congress of the Nobel Peace Prize in that year. So the UN Security Council and the General Assembly began treating climate impacts as matters of international security and development. Unfortunately, United States still did not endorse the protocol at that time. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement was reached under the UNFCCC. So there was virtually near universal political commitment to limit generating greenhouse gases and reduce global warming and address its impacts, which was entered into force in 2016. The United States declined endorsing also. Around this time, the United Nations leaders repeatedly called climate change the defining challenge for a global threat to development, security, and human well-being. So the then United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon had this statement to make, which was very impactful. He said, there is no plan B because there is no planet B. The essence of it is that if we continued to actually subject the globe to so much trade due to the effect of the generation of global emissions, there will not be an alternative plan since we do not have an alternative planet Earth. That was an impactful statement, and it generated so much controversy, particularly from the North American caucus. And then the Director General of the United Nations World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, fortunately is an African of Ethiopian origin, made this very important statement in 2019, that global change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. So you can see that the United Nations at its level, at its highest level, has admitted that global change is a potential monster that is facing or that is waiting to be unleashed on humanity. And unfortunately, there's little or no change in the generation of greenhouse gases that face the world. So what is global change or climate change? So I'm going to take two definitions, and I'm going to actually talk about one of it in summary. The first, of course, the definition is the first article of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Conventions, that is the UNFCCC. And it defined global change as a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. And this is usually the definition that is typically adopted for international treaties, laws, and policies when you mean and when you refer to that they are attributable to human causes. And then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Conventions glossary defined climate change as a change in the state of the climate that can be identified, example, by using statistical tests, that is by changes in the mean or variability of its properties, such as the temperature, the precipitation, that is the waterfall, and the wind direction and everything, and that persists for an extended period, typically over a decade or longer. And this definition covers changes from any cause, whether natural or anthropogenic. By anthropogenic, it means whether they are due to human causes or they are due to natural causes, unless the context specifies otherwise. So this definition is typically adapted in scientific discussions where both natural variabilities and human influences are considered. So in summary, climate change means long-term shifts in temperature, rainfall, winds, and other climatic features. But in policy context, it usually refers specifically to those changes that are attributable to human causes. So climate change, obviously, from all these preambles that have been highlighted, it's a public health emergency. Why is it a public health emergency? It causes a direct increase in health harms, such as more frequent acute and intense heat waves and heat-related illnesses and death, heat strokes, exacerbation of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, and overwhelming emergency services. And extreme weather conditions such as storms, floods, wildfires could cause injuries, drowning, burns, acute respiratory illnesses from smoke, and rapid disruption of services and clean water. And then it may have substantial indirect impact on downstream health effects. This could include infectious diseases. We've never had things like the Middle East respiratory syndrome until at the end or at the beginning of the 21st century. We've never had things like SARS. We've never had things like the COVID. All these could be attributable to global change change, although there are no empirical evidence that have linked them. So infectious diseases could emerge due to changing temperature, precipitation, and ecosystems could alter the geographic range and seasonality and transmission intensity of vector-borne diseases. Of course, we've had things like dengue, we've had things like malaria prevalence increases, and of course, in the East African continents, they have things like the chikungunya and so many other viral-borne diseases, such as the mpox and so many other things. We've never had these diseases before, but even if we had them, the epidemic proportion at which they occur are not as they occur presently. Could it be due to effect of global change and maybe due to some waterborne diseases? And then, of course, food and water security could be implicated. This is directly linked to, as a public health emergency, due to changing rainfall patterns. There could be drought and extreme events, reducing crop yields and fisheries and increasing malnutrition, and of course, micronutrient deficiencies. And even the quality of air we breathe. You can believe with me that the quality of air you breathe in Lagos and the quality of air someone breathes in maybe outskirts of Lagos, if you are to go to Badagry, is not the same, because there are so many industries that are generating greenhouse gases that are causing a lot of changes in the temperature and even the quality of air that you breathe in. Studies have been conducted in Japan that have shown that there are deposits of asbestos, and even in parts of India, in near industries where they produce asbestos, and that is known as asbestosis. And of course, they breathe them through the air without knowing. All these have direct impacts on the global climate conditions. And of course, the most another important one as a psychiatrist is the mental and the social and long-term health impacts. As a result of global climate changes, you witness disasters. And of course, all of us are aware of the disasters that develop post-trauma. So post-traumatic disaster, post-disaster trauma that develop, and such as post-traumatic stress disorders, are all related mental health complications. And of course, people that have post-traumatic stress disorder that is not well treated could actually lead to depression. And of course, ultimately, they may start using substances in a way that is maladaptive. And of course, another very important thing, concept that is evolving in the climate change world, or in the psychosocial world, is the concept of eco-anxiety. That is an anxiety state that develops as a result of consistent or persistent fear that the global climatic condition might change. And of course, everybody knows displacement and conflict. People that are displaced from their ancestral homes as a result of harsh climatic changes and climate-related loss of lands and livelihoods contributes to migration, social disruption, and heightened risks of violence and infectious disease spread. These all contribute to the development or have their psychosocial consequences. And then global climate change could affect health systems and public infrastructures, which are vulnerable. Health facilities, the supply chains, the cold chains for vaccines, the surveillance systems, and workforce capacity can be disrupted by extreme climate events or gradual climate impacts, reducing capacity to prevent and treat diseases when the need arises. I was in Maiduguri after the 2024 flood that submerged virtually 50% of Maiduguri. The University of Maiduguri Teaching Hospital, where I work presently, was virtually submerged. The newly constructed cancer center that cost the government over 3 billion naira to construct with state-of-the-art facilities was submerged, and the whole facilities including radiotherapy that was invested in that project got vanished over the night. And virtually the whole of Northeast sub-region, and to some extent people from southern parts of Niger, Cameroon, and Chad Republic assess treatments, their oncological treatments at the University of Maiduguri Teaching Hospital. That had never happened over the past 30 years. And of course, the whole teaching hospital was submerged underwater or flood, and it shows how global change could affect. And that facility has up till now not been restored. And then there's disproportionate impacts and equities. I think the chairman and the chairperson made an important statement at the beginning in her opening speech that usually the vulnerable groups are the first people that are the most that are affected. And the burden falls heaviest on children, elderly, pregnant women, those with chronic diseases, outdoor workers, and low-income communities, and many indigenous and low-resource countries. And this, unfortunately, they are victims because they have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's large projected burdens and costs, and this is an urgency for prevention. Current evidence and projections shows that rising morbidity and mortality attributable to global change are absent, and there's absent strong mitigation and adaptation strategies. And framing it as an emergency emphasizes that delayed actions increases avoidable deaths and disability and economic cost. So what is the nexus between global change and substance use disorders? This is a very important, it's a two-paged diagram. The first actually shows global climate stressors, and these stressors could be in the form of intensified storms. It could be in the form of worse floods. It could be in the form of amplified heat waves, and it could be in the form of augmented droughts and fires. It could actually cause other ecological changes or environmental changes and shift weather baselines. When this starts from acute to chronic, it now causes climate stressors. These climate stressors now affect the vulnerable communities, and it increases from mild to severe. And this leads to changes in their biological and psychosocial as well as environmental adaptations. So there could be increased insect-borne vectors, there could be school closures and unemployment, there could be disrupted social networks, and there could be food shortages and malnutrition, and there could be forced migration and civil unrest. These exposures lead to risk pathways. And these risk pathways include destabilization of psychosocial functioning, which will include environmental, economic, and geopolitical and social support systems. This could be due to loss of crops, altered landscapes, there could be war, there could be destroyed infrastructure, and there could be forced migration. Or it could lead to increased rates of mental disorders and worsening symptoms, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety. Earlier, we've talked about eco-anxiety. It could lead to relapses, particularly for people with substance use disorders that have now been exposed to a traumatic experience of climate change, and it could lead to development of depression and early onset risks in vulnerable populations. And of course, it could lead to increasing physical health problems, such as injuries. There could be infections and respiratory diseases. Everybody knows that cholera is a sequelae of flooding. There could be malnutrition when there's quantum loss of food, and it could lead to food insecurity. It could lead to air pollution, and it could lead to prolonged allergic season. And of course, there could be other incremental harmful changes as shown in 4, and there could be negative emotional responses to anticipated or experienced harms, such as worries, anger, grief, fear, guilt, and hopelessness. And then all these will lead to maladaptive coping strategies. And one of the maladaptive coping strategies that are commonly used in this environment is harmful psychoactive substance use, and of course, increased relapse vulnerability. Of course, the picture clearly shows an increase in the level of drinks. It could be in alcoholic drinks or other forms of drinks. It could be in the form of smokes. It could be in the forms of injectables, or it could be in the forms of inhalants. These all have their behavioral consequences and leads to comorbidities. And of course, all this could only be prevented when there are strategic actions that are taken to prevent or to treat the maladaptive coping strategies that have been developed. And that's where drug demand reduction will come into being. It consists of primary prevention, secondary prevention, substance use disorder treatment, and of course, relapse prevention and treatment of associated comorbidities. Now, we've seen clearly how global climate change could lead to the development of substance use disorder, and of course, the risk pathways that have been illustrated. And of course, this clearly establishes the nexus between substance use disorders and of course, global climate change. Now, what are the intersections between climate change and substance use disorders? First, of course, is the climate-related events. Of course, extreme weather conditions could lead to slow onset changes, loss of livelihood, perceived climate anxiety could lead to, all this leads to increased traumatic exposure, chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. All these are established risk factors for initiating or escalating substance use and for relapse among people in recovery. So examples are higher rates of alcohol and substance use disorder have been documented after hurricanes, floods, and other disasters. And of course, there could be acute disasters and service disruption. Floods, storms, wildfires, and related evacuations disrupt access to treatment. For instance, if it were to be in Maiduguri last year that after the flood, and particularly if the medication state treatment site were to have been sited in the teaching hospital, obviously people that will have been benefiting from drug demand reduction services and particularly harm reduction services will have been disenfranchised. And of course, harm reduction services such as needle exchange, supervised consumption sites, primary care, and emergency services will all be disrupted when there are acute disasters. And then there are interrupted medications for all those already that are on opiate use disorder treatment or withdrawal management. So such services, if they are disrupted, could lead to increased relapse and overdose and risks of overdose during and after emergency or climatic trauma, environmental disasters. And then, of course, there's this concept of toxicodynamics, which is due to an increase in the heat and the physiology of the human being. That extreme heat and heat waves pose direct physiological risks for people using certain substances, and particularly opioids have been documented as sedatives, which tend to impair thermoregulation. That's why people that are opiate dependent, when they are in the stages of their withdrawal, you see them sweating profusely. And of course, stimulants cause dehydration and increase heat stress. When dehydration or cardiovascular strain can worsen drug toxicity. And heat waves are also associated with increases in emergency visits and mortality for substance-related conditions. The other ones are air pollution, smoke, and respiratory vulnerabilities. Wildfire, smoke, and air pollution worsen respiratory and cardiovascular diseases and raising risks for people who smoke substances or have comorbidities. Smoke exposure can also increase overall health stress and mental health burden. And then, of course, due to displacement, migration, and social disruption, climate-driven displacement, loss of housing and community fragmentation, disrupted social support systems, and increased exposure to environments where risky substances is more likely. So migrant and displaced populations often face barriers to care, legal and financial precariousness, and higher substance use disorders vulnerability. All these are attributable to global climatic changes. And of course, we all know the economic impacts and social determinants. Climate impacts on agriculture, fisheries, or other local economics raise unemployment and financial insecurity, which are all linked to higher substance use and overdose rates. And of course, chronic food or housing insecurity are also upstream drivers for substance use disorders. So the intersection also continues between climate change and substance use disorders, the drug market and supply chain effects. I've initially told you about the initial effects of drought. And if there's drought, maybe they now move to alternate cultivation to crops that are drought resistant. And I cited example of how opium poppy is being cultivated in high amount because of drought in Pakistan and Afghanistan, because they are one of the major drivers of this product, the production of the global opium poppy, and this all leads to access to affect access to medications for opioid disorders and naloxone. And of course, it also leads to a booming illicit drug market. And it also supply disruptions can change availability and price composition of street drugs. And of course, recent adulteration or increase in fentanyl prevalence in North America is a clear example of effect of primary climate change. And of course, there are longer time changes in agriculture. Crop yields reduce and could affect production of plant-based drugs in some regions. The Afghanistan's example is a clear testimony to that. And there are breakdown in healthcare system and resilience as well as preparedness. Health systems are stressed by climate-driven changes, such as heat-related illnesses, disasters associated with injuries, which may deprioritize substance use disorder services in preference for the treatment of disorders that are physically related due to effect of climate changes. And infrastructure damage can interrupt cold chain storage and electronic records and pharmacy services that are critical for the continuity of care for people with substance use disorders. And then, of course, there are inequities and disproportionate impacts. People with substance use disorders are often marginalized, homeless, they are poor, they are criminally liable, and of course, they are most likely going to have comorbid mental illnesses. And thus, they are disproportionately affected by climate hazards. And racially and economically marginalized communities also tend to face greater climate exposure and lower adaptive capacity, like we've stated initially. So what are drug demand reduction strategies? So we've now, from the beginning, we've looked at the historical perspective of how climate change affects the public health. And we've now established a linkage between climate change and increased vulnerability to substance use disorder. And now the whole topic is integrating drug demand reduction strategies into climate change action. What are those drug demand strategies? Drug demand reduction strategies are interventions and policies designed to lower people's desire for initiation of or continued use of psychoactive substances, both licit and illicit. They differ from supply reduction, which is the Law Enforcement Act. I think Madam Ibiba is an expert in the Law Enforcement Act that lay more emphasis in the interdiction of drugs. But we in the drug demand reduction space focus more on prevention, treatment, behavioral change, and reducing the harms that perpetuate the use of drugs. So there are 7 key strategies, and we're going to look at them. The first strategy is prevention. That is to reduce initiation and early use. And these preventions are divided broadly into 2. Universal prevention, which targets the whole populations, and it could be like school-based life skill programs, and then life skills training or mass media campaigns and social norms. So you see a lot of them. When we come to talk about the case scenario in Nigeria, we'll talk about some of the school-based programs that aim at prevention. Or it could be selective prevention, which you target at-risk groups, particularly family strengthening programs, strengthening families, mentoring for vulnerable youths. And I've seen Madam Ibiba on so many occasions. I've been her keen follower on her WhatsApp status. I see virtually on every weekend she has one program to do with youth groups. This is a typical example of either a universal prevention or a selective prevention strategy. So the strategy Madam Ibiba is adopting is a preventive strategy, which reduces the initiation or early use of drug. The second strategy in DR space is early identification and brief intervention. So we have what we call the screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. That is what is known as the SBIRT. So some people commonly call it the SBED, but it's not appropriate because I attended a program with a professor of addiction and I said SBED and he didn't know what I was referring to. So, and that could be integrated into primary healthcare services. So the SBIRT services, it will only include screening with a very short instrument that even primary school teachers can administer, and then link it into primary healthcare services. That's one thing that is lacking in Nigeria. Drug treatment services are only restricted to few federal tertiary health institutions and few private institutions. They are not linked to primary services. They are not linked to secondary care services, which is a major risk. And of course, emergency departments could not even identify, and even schools, there are no school-based programs, but we'll talk about it. And of course, motivational interviewing to increase readiness to change, particularly for at-risk groups. And then of course, the next thing is if the prevention fails, the early identification fails, the next thing will be to identify those who have been using and to enroll them into treatment and rehabilitation. The essence of this phase is to reduce dependence and relapse. So evidence-based psychosocial therapies, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, and positive family therapy have shown to be effective. And of course, pharmacotherapeutic interventions, particularly the medication-assisted treatment we are doing in Nigeria, is a typical example. And of course, long-term recovery supports such as residential rehabilitation programs or outpatient programs or aftercare services. Of course, one major problem we have is that in Nigeria, we currently do detoxification and rehabilitation services, but aftercare services are lacking. And of course, someone who is drug dependent, even after the care, you need to actually empower that person socio-economically. There are virtually non-existent of employment and housing support for them. So these are very key areas that we look at in the drug demand reduction space. And of course, if the person is using, there's the need for us to adopt harm reduction strategies. The essence of harm reduction is to reduce the adverse consequences of the drug use, both physically, psychologically, and socially. And such adverse consequences could be like people who inject drugs, they are likely to transmit blood-borne viruses such as HIV and hepatitis B. But by incorporating harm reduction programs like needle and syringe program, you reduce their possibilities of exchanging needles and syringes. And of course, the risks of transmitting the disease from one person to the other. And of course, supervised consumption and of course, community distribution of naloxone and self-prescribing guidelines. This all aim at reducing morbidities and mortality that are associated with drug use. And then another very important thing is that you may have a very good preventive program. You may have a very good early identification and brief intervention strategies. You may have a very good treatment and rehabilitation services. You may have good harm reduction services. But what drives it is the policy and regulation and economic and social measures. So this is another area that we are lacking in Nigeria. The policies to drive drug demand reduction are very, very minimal, or it's just of recent that have been developed. We have the National Drug Control Master Plan that talks about the 4 key pillars initially, and recently we are working with Madam Ibiba and Madam Ngozi Ogujiofo to develop a more encompassing control master plan, but very little policy to drive the drug demand reduction are available. Of course, we are working at the National Technical Working Group level to develop the national policy on drug demand reduction and harm reduction. How I wish this will come to see the light of the day. So it talks about prescription for drug monitoring programs, regulation of marketing, age limits and price policies, and taxation for alcohol and tobacco. There's what they refer to as sin tax in those advanced societies whereby those alcohol and tobacco products are highly taxed, that it makes it an unattractive business for people to be engaged in. And of course, the social and structural interventions such as poverty reduction, job training, stable housing, and schooling, and address of drivers of drug use are not properly addressed in the current strategies that we have in place. And of course, another very important thing, you may have the regulations, you may have the policies, you have the harm reduction, treatment, and preventions and early identification. Drug users are usually vulnerable in the community after discharge. Therefore, there's the need for us to have a very good community and peer-based approach. Community-based approaches include things like the Alcohol Anonymous and the Narcotics Anonymous and the community coalitions and faith-based outreach and work programs. We have some faith-based organizations that are doing a lot of work, particularly in the southern part of the country. I must commend our Christian brothers and sisters that the awareness of drug demand reduction and particularly the community-based intervention is more anchored in churches than it is in mosques for some of us that are Muslims. And it's a very good way of attacking the drug epidemic, particularly in the context of the climate change. And of course, it's very important to have strategic behavioral communication strategies. So social marketing, public education, stigma reduction campaigns, and targeted messaging using digital and social media platforms. These are the key principles that are used in drug demand reduction. So the principles of effective drug demand reduction must observe these 3 basic principles. They must be evidence-based. No matter how good an intervention is, if it is not evidence-based, it's not actually considered in the drug demand reduction space. And it must be comprehensive and multi-sectoral. So which means the prevention, the treatment, the harm reduction, the social services and policy will include a lot of multi-sectoral partners that are involved. So it's not just the doctor or the psychiatrist that will treat a person who is having substance use disorder, and then you discharge him who without having an appropriate community of people that he will liaise with, or an appropriate family environment that he will go back with, or a law enforcement community that would discriminate that person or stigmatize that person. So, and DDR will have a comprehensive drug demand reduction program, should be multi-sectoral and interlinked, and it must be targeted and culturally appropriate. So we are not just going to adapt something from the West and apply it hook, line, and sinker without adapting to make it culturally relevant to our own cultural peculiarities. So that must be done, and it must be accessible and with low barrier, and which means it must reduce stigma, and it must not have any logistic barriers to access. And of course, there must be continuum of care. The continuum of care means the screening, the treatment, and the aftercare services, which means even while the person is at home after being disengaged from the treatment services, services are continuously being provided on long-term basis. And of course, there must be monitoring and evaluation to measure the outcomes and adapt. These are 5 key principles or 6 key principles that are very important in any drug demand reduction program. So what is the current drug demand reduction situation in Nigeria? We have advocacy and sensitization, and to some extent, the credit must be given to the NDLA under the able leadership of retired General Mohammed Marwa, who has been able to actually engage so many community stakeholders, particularly traditional leaders, religious leaders, and even wives of state governors. Currently, there have been the establishment of state action committees that are supposed to drive drug demand reduction and even prevention and even supply reduction services at the state levels. But how many states have implemented them, and how active are they? And then one of the prevention strategies we talked about is the universal prevention or the selective prevention. In Nigeria, we've implemented the Unplugged. The Unplugged is an evidence-based school-based intervention that has been implemented in 103 federal unity colleges. The states and, of course, private institutions that constitute most of the schools have not implemented this program. So there's a need to scale up this program at the national level to involve all schools, which will make it more universal than selective. And of course, for children that are out of school, since the Unplugged targets school is a school-based intervention for out-of-school children, what form of intervention will you do? It's called the LULU, the Live Up, the Line Up, Live Up. It's actually a program that targets non-school-based children, for instance, street children in northern Nigeria, like the Almajiris. The LULU will be a very good intervention. And then, of course, treatment and rehabilitation services. I've talked to us initially that there are only 11 treatment centers that are advocated and have been identified by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime and have been accredited by the Federal Ministry of Health to serve as treatment and rehabilitation centers. And there are centers that are run by the National Drug Law Enforcement Agencies, and there are few private facilities all over the country. There are less than 100 private rehabilitation and treatment facilities for people who use drugs. For a population of 230 million people, this is grossly inadequate. And in aftercare services, there are supposed to be one-stop shops or drop-in centers in the community where people who have substance use disorders can go there to while away time in a safe environment that is non-discriminatory. In this environment, I think very few DICs exist. I think I saw 2 in Lagos and 1 probably in Owerri. I don't know of the other parts of the country. So how will you now integrate people that have drug or substance use disorders in the context of an already tensed system that is plagued by climate changes? And of course, harm reduction services are virtually non-available. The opioid substitution therapy in Nigeria we've started, which is known as the MAT. We've piloted it in Maiduguri. And of course, currently it's being implemented in Gombe State. And 3 other states will start implementing this December. That is Anambra, Ebonyi, and Kwara State. So only 4 states are providing medication-assisted treatment services for people who have opiate use disorders. And based on the National Drug Use Survey, there are over 10 million people who use opiates. How are we going to tackle that situation? And then, of course, even the needle and syringe programs, I think they were just implemented in 10 global funded states. That is, I know of Gombe, I know of Akwa Ibom, I know of Ebonyi, I know of Kwara, I know of Lagos. Lagos were included because of its strategic significance, and the FCT and 3 other states, but they are not extended to the remaining 26 states. So what happens to people who inject drugs in those communities? And of course, naloxone for overdose management is virtually non-available apart from the 4 states that have started implementing MAT. And then socioeconomic empowerment. There's no way you can intervene in any drug demand reduction program without socioeconomically empowering those that are involved with substance use disorders. There's virtually non-existent program that gives them that empowerment. And in Nigeria, there are no support groups that takes care of people who have substance use disorders. There are very few that are mostly community, civil, CSO, and NGO driven. But for you to have proper, like Narcotic Anonymous or Alcoholic Anonymous communities that are the key drivers, they are relatively very, very few. I know of 2 or 3. I know of the Narcotic Anonymous program that exists at Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital, ARO program. I know one that exists at the Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital here in Maiduguri that we are championing. I know of one that exists with a private facility. I cannot name the facility because I have not sought for the permission of the owner to mention. And in Nigeria, this is the state of drug demand reduction services. And even the policies that are supposed to serve as enablers, as drivers for the drug demand reduction situation in Nigeria are not in place. Apart from the National Drug Control Master Plan, and I told you of the drug demand reduction master plan that we are working with, nothing is in place. So you can imagine the harsh situation we find ourselves in. So what are the integrative strategies to incorporate drug demand reduction strategies into climate change actions? First is to have a framework that integrates climate and drug demand reductions. And the essence of this framework is triple. It has a triple aim. It improves health outcomes, it ensures environmental sustainability, and improves resilience or community resilience. And these levels of action are taken at all levels, at individual level, whether it is a person or at the clinical level, or it is at organizational level or programmatic level, or it's going to be at the community level or at a policy level. So it's going to be at multi-layered levels that incorporates DDR actions into climate change actions. So first, integrating prevention strategies with climate change actions, prevention strategies. There's the need to integrate climate-related mental health resilience, like better coping strategies, into prevention curricula, which could be community-based or school-based. And of course, just like the Lulu, resilience building and coping, adaptive coping strategies could be incorporated into their programs, and then promote community resilience building, such as enabling, if you go to Asia and some parts of, I was in the United States, in the state of Colorado, for instance, you see a lot of green spaces. These have a lot of impact on the well-being of the people, both psychologically and physically. And then community centers, which will serve as protective factors to people who use drugs. And then there's the need, of course, to engage youth in climate change actions as positive identities and purposes, which actually reduces their risks of behaviors. So what are the metrics that will judge this intervention or this strategy? We'll use the rates of initiation, participation in resilience programs, of course, and youth mental health indicators. These are very good prevention strategies that could be intercalated into climate change actions. And then the second thing is treatment strategies that reduce emissions and increase resilience. clinical services adaptation. Before the program, I saw the documentary that was showing how Morocco is generating a lot of clean energy from solar. And these are ways that our hospitals or our university education systems could be driven by clean energies, which will reduce the generation of greenhouse gases and will reduce harsh climatic weather conditions. And we could also expand our services via telehealth, particularly for SGUD services. And we could decentralize medication distribution programs like via take-home policies or mobile dosing or community pharmacy levels to reduce client travel and improve continuity during disasters. And we could also implement low carbon facility strategies such as energy efficiency. In my hospital, in Federal Neuropsychiatric Hospital, before I left as the MD some 3 months ago, virtually 60 or 70% of the hospital has been off-grid, is solar driven. So we are indirectly saving cost, but we are also indirectly protecting the environment from using generators and other sources of energy that will generate carbon-based greenhouse gases that will cause harsh climate changes. And of course, our medication as resilient supply, we could ensure resilient supply chains, such as through alternative formulations and contingency protocols. And we could also promote responsible prescribing and dis-prescribing where appropriate to reduce pharmaceutical wastages and diversions. So, and then how do we integrate harm reduction services into climate change action? We could maintain climate-proof syringes and exchange naloxone. And naloxone, that I saw a syringe in Kenya when I went as a member of the National Technical Working Group on Harm Reduction that is biodegradable. So, but most of the syringes we use here are non-biodegradable. So we are contributing to developing non-biodegradable wastages in the environment. So if such could be, and then convert single use to lower waste options where safe and feasible sub-disposal programs could be incorporated to prevent environmental contamination. And very importantly, workforce training staff in disaster readiness, climate risk assessment, and trauma-informed care. So the metrics that could be used in judging this are the continuity of care during events and telehealth uptake, and of course, carbon footprint per patient visit. The carbon footprint could be, for instance, replacing non-biodegradable needles with biodegradable ones. These are all reducing by carbon footprints per patient visit. And then how do we integrate DDR during the recovery and social integration phase into climate positive opportunities? A lot of green jobs now. There are so many industries that are cropping up that generate solar panels, that produce lithium inverters. And even in Nigeria, they are cropping up. Youth could be channeled into such green jobs and generation of and other renewable energy sources and conservation of urban green areas. And this could serve as important recovery programs for people that are already into SUDs. And then, of course, community gardening. These have virtually been eroded in most African cities. Community gardeners have been, when we were growing up, when we were young in Jos Plateau State, in virtually all households, you see a little household garden, but this culture has been eroded. And of course, social enterprises that could foster the economic capacities of people who use drugs could be incorporated into the integration phase, and urban forestry to support recovery and food security and other social capital. And of course, very, very important in the recovery phase, peer support networks that double as community resilience networks. So what are the metrics that we are going to use in judging the integration of these recovery phase into climate positive opportunities? We could use employment into green sectors among people in recovery, their housing stability, and reduction in their relapse rates. So harm reduction and disaster preparedness. Disaster planning for harm reduction services, pre-positioning naloxone, mobile units, contact lists, and mutual aid coalitions could all be incorporated into the harm reduction program. and then ensure that there are legal and policy protections for mobile and emergency distribution of medications and services. Let me cite example of what I mean by this legal and policy protections. When we piloted the MAT in Maiduguri, I had a visit by an official of the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control that he came to arrest me that we were dispensing Schedule 1 narcotics. I didn't know that it's a national program. But of course, I did not blame him. If there were a national legal document or a policy that protects the institution from the harassment, that wouldn't have happened in the initial phase. But such things are non-existent in the country. And then, of course, there must be policy levers and multi-sectoral partnerships. Like I've said initially, integration of DDR into climate change must be multi-sectoral. They should include SUD considerations in climate change adaptation and health emergency plans. It should make SUD services essential in disaster response. Now, in disaster response, what they do when there's a flood, when there's a fire outbreak, probably the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, will just come and distribute foodstuffs and beddings. Nobody takes into cognizance people who use drugs and what are their needs at those periods of national emergencies. This should be integrated in all emergency services, and legal continuity for all such should be incorporated. And there should be incentivization of sustainable healthcare program procurement and funding for climate resilient SUD services. And of course, one of the most important aspects that I think should be at the policy level is decriminalization and regulated markets to reduce environmentally harmful illicit production forces. And this has been proven by contextual and by contextual factors and is evidence-based. What actually reduces the number of people with SUDs to come forward for services is they are criminalized against. And we've discussed this extensively on the need for having a threshold that would discriminate or differentiate between a user and a trafficker. So I've kept us for long. What are the recommendations? Obviously, you could agree with me that in Nigeria presently, there are virtually no policies that integrate, no policies for DDR in the first place. Talk less of policies that integrate DDR into climate programs. So there's the need for policy advocacy and development in that space. And of course, it's a multi-sectoral collaboration. The National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, the Federal Ministry of Health, the Federal Ministry of Environment, the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, different stakeholders, the religious, faith-based organizations, and so many, even the judiciary will be involved in the development of these policies. That's why I say there must be multi-sectoral collaborations and partnership. I've read throughout, I've never come across a research that has a longitudinal data that links climate change with substance use disorder. So for us to have a policy, it must be data-driven. So there is the need for us to conduct researches that could have a longitudinal linkage between climate change and SUDs. And of course, very importantly, we must have metrics for monitoring and evaluation with integrated indicators. There could be others that I've not mentioned here. I thank you so much for your kind attention. I think over the last 30 minutes, I've taken us, or more, I've taken us across this very important topic, integrating drug demand reduction into climate change actions and a synergistic public health approach. It's a privilege, and I appreciate your kind attention. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, thank you, ma'am.
You actually took us into the classroom, and I'm sure if we had to buy this paper, many of us on this call might not be able to afford it. It was comprehensive, it was detailed, it was informative, and in fact, anybody who wants to do a research already has the material to do that research on climate change. Climate change and drug demand. So much I learned from, and I know everybody on this call has learned a lot. You took us from the very beginning telling us it's an emerging issue. You took us to the historical perspective, the medieval period, to show that climate change really is not new. It might be taking a new dimension, but this science has been on even in the medieval times. You took us through
Yes,
the
ma'am.
global policies which are in place right now from the UN, the WHO. Then you gave us an overview of the world climate change situation as it is now, citing examples from America, from other countries, and even from Africa. Then you told us areas that climate change is affecting Africa, Nigeria included, talking of floods, drought. And when you mentioned drought, and told us that it actually promotes the cultivation of opioid poppies, heroin. This is quite frightening because already we've not been able to provide adequate interventions for those who are using opioids. And now we're hearing that in a couple of years, we're going to have more of the production. And you also told us that in the year 2030 to 2050, we're projecting that we're going to have 250,000 additional deaths occurring from issues of climate change. And the diseases that you highlighted are the diseases that we live with in Africa, talking about malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea. These are problems that we've not been able to solve, and telling us now, showing us evidence to prove that with the issue of climate change, we're going to have increase and more complications with these diseases. And the vulnerables, we're talking of older adults, women, children, people living with HIV, people in low-income communities. These are even people already having vulnerabilities to substance use that as a country, we've not even been able to address. So now getting to know that this group of people, target groups in communities, are the people who are also highly affected by climate change, talking about food insecurity, shift in cultivation, and all of that. It was very, very, very robust. And I'm sure many of us have learned a lot up to the recommendations, the areas we need to address, and even the current situation of lack of policies, poor infrastructure for drug demand reduction interventions in Nigeria as a country. So what it tells us is that we have a lot of work to do as practitioners and as stakeholders. And I'm happy on this call that we have those from international NGOs. I can see representatives from the Lions Club International, which conducts a lot, significant interventions in some of these areas. We have Ashiwaju Dakpo Wahab, who runs also a very thriving NGO in Ogun State. We have Ari Toku, who is a gender expert here. So we have people that we have past district governors of our Lions Club and experts on substance use and prevention. So I'm sure we have people on this call who will take this call running and ensure that we take some of these learnings into practice and ensure that we have improved outcomes, knowing that there's a lot of work to do. So thank you, Prof. We couldn't ask for any better speaker on this issue. And I want to seek your indulgence that maybe after this program, you share with us this paper, which we would also share to all of those who attended this event.
I will do that. Thank you, ma'am. Humbled.
Yes, thank you, Prof. The floor is now open. We want to entertain. Prof is still here with us for a couple of minutes, so we can entertain maybe from, say, 5 of the participants, questions, comments, if there are areas you need a clarification, so we can have all of those while we wrap up this session. Thank you very much for your keen attention, and thank you, Prof, once again. I appreciate this, and I can assure you it will not be taken for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Humbled. I'm honored.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So the floor is open by the raise of hand, or you just unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So, and I want to say a very big thank you to Prof for the wonderful session. But then again, I have a question regarding drug abuse, especially to unborn children, because with the increasing rate of drug abuse disorder in our country, we should not be surprised that yes, in the years to come, we'll see infants, newborn babes that are already addicted, are already showing like withdrawal symptoms. like concerning drug abuse and the likes, right? So what can the government do, and what care can be put to place for our mothers, most especially as the pregnant women and the likes? Like, what prevention can be put in place for them, and what policy, what intervention program will be needed? Because we should not be surprised that in the years we'll see children, like newborn babes, already addicted on substance, already using substance, although they've not started using it themselves, but because of the mother to child relationship, they are already addicted, they are already on drugs, and this will affect them, like physical, mental, and every aspect of their life, actually. That's my question, sir.
So that's very good. Abosede, I think that's the name I saw. Yeah. So, hello. So that's a very good question, Abosede. It's not a new concept already. The features of withdrawal being noticed in neonates or newborns. Already it has been documented that about 10 to 15% of women who use opiates give birth to children who develop neonatal opiate withdrawal syndrome. That has been documented. And of course, in the harm reduction strategy, that's where the target is supposed to be. But of course, drug use disorder or substance use disorder is supposed to be on a spectrum. And the management should start from prevention. But once the person develops the disorder, the target will be on reducing the harm that is associated with it. So for women who use drugs and are pregnant, particularly the opiates, they are placed on opiate substitution therapy, which in the Nigerian context, we call it the medication-assisted treatment. Why we don't like calling it opiate substitution therapy, because when there was a stakeholder engagement, when we were to initiate the program, so many people raised concerns that if you say it's a substitution, people will think you are substituting one addiction with another. So Nigeria and other African countries adopted the terminology medication-assisted treatment. And in women that are on medication-assisted treatment, once they enter the third trimester, that is their last 3 months of pregnancy, that is from the 7th to the 9th month, you actually start reducing the dosage of the drugs that they will be placed in. Or if they are on methadone, you change them to buprenorphine. Buprenorphine has a less tendency of developing neonatal withdrawal, even if the mother was taking it. And then, of course, there are situations where it is inevitable. In such an inevitable situation, you have to prepare for the delivery. And in such delivery, a pediatrician, particularly a neonatologist, will be involved in the management of the child right from the delivery. And of course, they also have the neonatal version of the clinical opioid withdrawal scale. They call it the neonatal opioid withdrawal scale. They will measure to see the level of severity of the opioid withdrawal that the child has, and they manage him or her appropriately. So it's already an already existing situation. It's not like it will start developing. It has started developing already. I had a situation where I had a patient, they never knew that the woman was dependent on opiate, and she delivered. Of course, she was a single mother. And she delivered in the teaching hospital, and the child started having symptoms that they thought it was malaria, because the child, and of course, medically, it's not possible for a newborn to develop malaria because the blood at that level has not developed the red blood cells that will acquire for the malarial parasites to infest. The child was having running spikes of temperature. The child was shivering. The child was actually having nasal discharges, and it was in the course of consultation that they discovered that the woman was dependent on opiate, and when she delivered, she was not on any form of medication, and the child already developed dependence while he was in utero. So it's a situation that is already with us. We just have to have a very high index of suspicion, and of course, initiate management protocols. We already have a national guideline for MAT, I was involved in the development, and there are strategies that have been developed for children who have neonatal opiate withdrawal and other withdrawal symptoms that could be managed. I think in addition to this document, I will also share the national MAD SOP and guidelines with Madam Ibiba, and she will share with us. We will learn a lot from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. So I just want to add that in addition with your excellent response, that prevention might also be useful because we don't need to wait until the women are pregnant.
Yes,
so
exactly.
I want to advocate that practitioners and stakeholders should start to conduct aggressively programs for young girls, you know, before they even get to the age of being pregnant and having children, to know about lifestyles, to know about the dangers of drugs, not just for them at that period, for even when they advance to being able to have children and some of the effects these substances might have on them. So I think prevention also should scale up so that we have less complications to deal with at the treatment level.
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely, absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely. So, and I think one of our teachers that is an expert in addiction, led Professor Morakinyo, used to tell us that the best treatment for addiction or substance use disorder is prevention. So prevention is the most important or the most critical stage in the management.
A question or clarification, anybody wants to intervene before we wrap up?
Yes, just wanted to ask a question. Hello.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you so much. Like, I think I've never seen more clearly the connections between climate change and drug abuse before. I've worked in gender, you know, water, sanitation, climate change, and I've seen a lot of what you're talking about, the impacts of climate, actual impact on lives of women and children, you know, with, you know, the increasing impact of climate change. But my question is, you know, in the context of Nigeria, in fact, the issues are so enormous. I've gone to the IDP camps. I've gone.
Yes, ma'am.
I've talked to women, children, IDP camps. How do we? What can we do to make climate change an important issue in our context? Because Nigeria is so delicate. There are just so many issues, and oftentimes climate change looks like this is a luxury. Like you're just, looking at
it's
things
true.
that.
It's true.
Yeah. So, what can be done? Is it at the executive level, even with communities? How do we bring this issue, to the point where it can actually get the kind of attention within the context of, like, we're really in all sorts of challenges in Nigeria at the moment?
This is a very good question, ma. To be candid, we are in a country that we have leaders that are not sensitive to the plight of its citizens. If not, how will you explain a phenomenon whereby the Joint Health Sector Union and the National Association of Resident Doctors are on strike for more than a month, and the government has not made any concrete step to engage them? And of course, nobody seems to be saying anything. Let me just share my little experience on how we got that was why, if you look at my recommendation, when I was talking about the recommendation, I say no matter how excellent your ideas are, if you don't have the policy in place, it's just going to be a wasted venture. So it requires a lot of advocacy and policy development in that regard. The little experience I said I wanted to share is with regards to the Mental Health Act. As a psychiatrist, what we had until 2023 was the Lunacy Act of 1958 that our colonial masters bequeathed to us. In that Lunacy Act is still talking about the asylum system. It's still talking about treating a person who has a mental illness like a criminal. You must go to the magistrate to seek the court's approval before you can admit. And of course, it was referring to people that have mental illnesses as lunatics. Even the language is not friendly. And more or less, people that had mental illnesses in that act were treated more of criminals than people who were ill. And it was that policy that we had from 1958, even before we get independence, until 2021, that it was passed. So you can see how negligent our leaders or how complacent they could be when it comes to issues that affect the citizens. What we did was to involve a lot of community-based organizations and non-governmental organizations that were involved in advocacy for people, for vulnerable groups. We need to put to them and let them understand that a person who is mentally ill is also a vulnerable person. And of course, that will not even, I think the engagement of civil society organizations will be even easier for us that already on the global stage, drug demand reduction is receiving a global attention. And then, of course, making 1 or 2 contacts in the parliament to drive the policy and engaging international organizations like the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime to actually bring up something that actually shares the interlink between climate change and, of course, substance use disorder. If not, whatever you are going to do, you will hear the federal government talking about the environment policy. If you see the level of implementation, the National Assembly might pass it, but to implement it might be another very important, a very Herculean task to implement. So it's not just the policy, but is that political will to implement it there? So I think these are very critical questions that are even beyond our individual capacities to answer, that it will require the whole mobilization of the community to actually move against it. Madam Ibiba was the first person that talked to me about the powers of Pablo Escobar in Colombia then when he was constituting a national menace. The whole community has to move against him to actually make sure that they eliminate him. Until we have that community engagement and social mobilization, that all citizens take a matter of climate change and substance use disorder as a matter of national urgency and importance, I don't think we are going to make any headway. That's my, if it takes us taking placards to go to the gates of the National Assembly to advocate for policies that are climate friendly, let's do that. If Morocco could generate 100,000 megawatts of electricity, just like we watched on that documentary before the program started, why can Nigeria not do that? If Nigeria is still flaring gas in the Niger Delta, that is the cow that produces the milk for the whole nation and cannot manage it, and even from the global map that you've seen, the generation of greenhouse gases is higher in the coastal regions of Nigeria. Why can't we develop policies that will tackle that? I think these are questions for the whole Nigerians, and we should keep discussing on fora like this and escalate it to a national level until it gets to the politicians' level. And we can handle it. President Duterte in Philippines, before he won his election, the general commitment he made to the citizens of that country was that he was going to tackle the epidemic of drug abuse and drug trade in that country. And when he won the presidency, that was what he did. And it was on the basis of that campaign promise that people voted for him. Why can't we engage our politicians to actually develop policies and engage them right from before they are elected and bring these issues forward to them and make them know that these things are a real threat to national security, not just their positions as politicians. But we have leaders that are just interested in the office and the glamour that is associated with them, without taking into cognizance the security threat to their citizens. It's unfortunate.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. That's our reality. At times, like Arid said, it can really be overwhelming. But I still believe in the power of community. I believe a lot in the power of community. And I know as much as we come together and talk about these issues, it will start to gain momentum. But we just have to start somewhere.
Let's start escalating it, Ma.
Yes, yes.
And let's escalate it. And maybe, Ma, since you are in Lagos, maybe engage the Arise or channel and appear on a program and raise the issue, and we'll support you from background.
No problem. There's so much to do.
Yes, Ma. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Arid.
Do we have any other question or clarification so that we can wrap up this event? If we don't, okay, so it's like there's nobody who's...
Maybe I can just say one more thing before we close.
Okay, please do.
I think one area that is also really critical is the issue of poverty, because I found that a lot of the problems gravitate around poverty. Like when you look, because I mean, I work in gender, but we've come to see that the intersectionalities are so important. Like poverty is like...
It's very true.
So
that's why we're talking as one of the drug demand reduction strategies is psychosocial economic empowerment.
Yeah.
So psychosocial economic empowerment is so critical that it has both that it could be intercalated into both the drug demand reduction space and into the climate change space. If you don't empower people socio-economically, to be candid, no matter what you're going to do, that intersectionality is likely going to prevail.
Thank you so much. Really,
thank you, Arid. Thank you.
Gained a lot from your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Arid. So I think we're done with the questions and clarifications. So at this juncture, Senami, give us your brief on the call to action so that we round up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma.
Thank you so much, Ma. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Also, since we are talking about climate change, drug abuse, drug prevention, it is important for us to take some of these things into action. We should not just come to programs like this or to conferences like this. I would say like a webinar like this without taking good care or without listening to everything that has been said. We are not just to listen, but we are to reflect it in our actions, in our day-to-day life. So basically, we are to build a environment that is thriving, environment that is well established, environment that even our mind will be able to rest well. We're not just talking about drug abuse. We are not just talking about drug prevention. You know, drug abuse affects the mind, while climate change affects our environment. And anything that is affecting our environment will definitely affect our mind and will definitely affect our well-being and life. So we are to take care of the same way we are taking care of our health, we should also take care of our mind. In as much as we are taking care of our environment, we should not litter the ground with papers, we should not litter the ground with nylons, we should not to we should know how to manage our beings properly. That's our debts. We should know how to manage them properly. All these little actions prevent climate change, and also we should also learn how to plant. We should plant little trees today. We save like millions of people life later on. So we should not just cut down trees around us. We should build. When we cut one tree, we should build like 10 more. That is the same. So we should save our mind as much as we should save our environment, our earth, our planet. Thank you so much, Ma. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you, Senami. So, Jamiloju, give us the vote of thanks for us to wrap up this event. Jamiloju, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Jomiloju, and I'm the Public Relations Officer too for Phenomenal Strides Foundation. First and foremost, I want to say a very big thank you to Dr. Ibrahim Wakawa. So, I want to personally say thank you to you. And on behalf of the Phenomenal Strides Foundation, I also want to say a very big thank you. In fact, your speech is going to save millions of lives. Your speech has empowered my generation. I can easily tell people that no matter what they stand to gain, they should always say no to some of these issues affecting our society. They should always be able to point and make the right decision in the face of anything. Like Senami said, they should always be able to do the right thing. They should always be able to care for their environment in as much as they care for themselves. And I want to say a big thank you to each and every one of our participants. Right now we have about 20 to 40 participants. And when we began the call, I think monitoring the chat, we've had in total about 100 to 200 participants. I want to say a very big thank you to everyone that was able to join the meeting. I want to say thank you to the entire Phenomenal Strides Foundation team, Mr. Shegun, Mr. Yodele, and I want to especially appreciate a woman of grace, a woman of honor, who God has brought up for this great cause, this great call to action. Mrs. Ibiba Odili, she's our creative director slash founder. Mommy, you are blessed, and I want to say well done. Continue the job in this same light, and may God give you the force to continue to fight against the bad people and the bad things that are being done to our society. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim Wakawa. I personally will put you in mind if I have anything, because you are a great person by how you've spoken. Thank you, Senami. Thank you, Ayodele. Thank you to our founder, and thank you to everyone that participated in the call. God bless you, and I pray that the message you've heard would help you to make the right decision. Thank you very much, everyone. God bless you, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Jomiloju. I want to appreciate my Egbon, former director of NDLA, Dr. Wale, who is here on this call, my past district governor, Linda Odumbaku, my second vice district governor for my district, Lion Ronke Adiagbo, my big great sister, Lion Joyce Akpata, Ashiwaju Dakbo Wahab, who represents Ashiwaju Dakbo Wahab Foundation. And these are great minds that I know after today, there will be a lot of collaborative talks and actions between all of us. Prof, be ready. You instigated this, and we're going to rely on your vast wealth of experience wherever you are to still not just to move on and do greater things for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This was a wonderful experience for me personally. I learned a lot, and I've known that there's so much more we can do together. Just little steps, really. It does not have to be elaborate. Just little steps, and we'll get there someday and make the world a better place for us to inhabit. And for us, definitely know we will leave the world also someday for those coming after us to have a better world. Thank you so much, and goodbye. And
everyone,
I wish you all,
Mommy, I want to, on this last note, say a very big congratulations. I'm asked to announce to everyone that we are congratulating Mommy Ibiba Odili. She just got invited to be one of the experts in the global initiative against transnational organized crime. I want to say a very big congratulations to you. She's joining a group of ambassadors who are to advise and offer mentorship to the global initiative against transnational organized crime. It's a multinational and world recognized organization. So we want to say a very big congratulations to you, mommy. Congratulations once again, ma.
Thank you, Jamiloji. Thank
Yes,
you.
ma.
Thank you. So I wish us all a pleasant good night rest. Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.